So today's going to be an interesting things hidden discussion. I'm joined by someone who I've gotten to know via email. He's a regular listener of our program. His name is Leonardo Mercado, and he's been telling me a lot of interesting things about all kinds of things we could get into. But we're going to start off with this discussion talking about forbidden medicines, because this is something that I think is tied to the heart of the state and governments. And even before we had states, you know, the archaic societies and ancient societies, they structured their idea of the sacred, that which is untouchable, around oftentimes what you could consume for food and what you could do for healing. And so you had the rain man, you had the medicine man, and you had these different figures, priestly caste that could heal and some that couldn't. And you had certain tribes in ancient societies where if the person did not perform the right rituals to make the rain come, he could be sacrificed. So someone could be a king or a chieftain or a hero one minute, and then the crowd turns on them if they don't provide the good medicine for the problems of the time. Now, Rene Girard talks about these ideas in the sense that, like, the pharmakos ritual in Greece was this, where we get pharmacy and pharmaceuticals, this idea of, something that's poison but also good for you. And that was a sacrifice of someone who was different to vent the tensions of the community. But oftentimes disease and famine and food issues were at the heart of what was considered to be sacred and clean versus unclean. So that's a big opening. But Leonardo, if you want to jump in, sir, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Hi, David. It's good to be here with you. I've been listening to your program, and I think it was 3 or 4 months ago, you brought up, I think it was a news report of new research being allowed into certain psychedelic substances for PTSD therapy, end-of-life therapy, and you thought it was an interesting subject. I shot you a little email, and I said, no, I've been looking into this for many years. Stream might be waking up to these alternative therapies that were basically forbidden for us to discuss as I was growing up. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, 30, 40 years later, it turns out that I was found a lot of personal healing using traditional medicines. And in my family, I have a family that was very familiar with using plants as medicines as I was growing up. And my Nana and Tata basically relied on keeping and gathering traditional medicines for kids well during the winter sicknesses and things like that. Well, when I was about 16 years old, being very friendly with certain tribal people where I grew up, I became very interested in the concept of a sacred plant, of which traditional cultures have many, but in particular, I became interested in the subject of the Peyote Cactus and how it's used as medicine and as a religious sacrament, actually, in our country here. And boy, it was, unless you knew somebody who knew something about it, it was not an easy subject to find information about. Most of the information was straight up anthropological and very little experiential content available for, like, does this actually help? Is this a medicine? Is this sacred? And through the years, I became more involved with these traditional people who knew how to use these plants. And it was personally a revelation. And I felt like, well, how many other things are we not being told about that can help us? So fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, and I thought of you again because I had a personal healing experience with another forbidden medicine, which is Ivermectin. My teenage boy came down with the COVID, and boy, 4 days later, I had it too. And I thought to myself, well, this is a point where I have to make a decision. As an individual, do I just lay here and suffer in bed and see how long it takes to get over this? Or do I get myself some ivermectin. And unfortunately, I actually had to get the equestrian type. And I know this is being poo-pooed in the news right now, but that was the decision I made. I thought it just doesn't make sense to not at least try this. And I can't vouch for how it would help anybody else, but I know it definitely helped me. Within 12 hours or so of taking my first dose on my first day of real bad symptoms, I would estimate about 60% of those symptoms went away. And I thought, well, it could be a coincidence, but I'm feeling a lot better.
Right.
So the next morning I woke up, tried it again. I thought, might as well. And by the end of that day, all the severe symptoms were actually gone. I had no more fever, no more body aches, no more laying around groaning in bed. So I thought maybe I made the right decision here. And the rest of the symptoms are just kind of a lingering type, a little bit of, lethargy, not quite feeling 100%, but it seemed to be very helpful. And that's why I thought of you. I thought, well, here's another case where I had to do my own research. Nobody was just coming out and saying, here's something that can help you. I had to find it myself. And that's where I got this idea of all my life, I've been following these forbidden medicines, and here's just the latest.
Yeah, it reminds me, again, I don't tell people what medicine to take or what. That's not my whole approach. I've never been that way. But I see the parallels between the history or the anthropology that we look at of societies that say these are official good medicine and these are official bad medicine. And if you touch the bad medicine, you're sacrificed, you're scapegoated out of society. And if you touch the king's decreed medicine, then you're part of the sacred space and you can continue. So that word sacred, when I use it, is kind of, it doesn't mean necessarily good, like in a true sacred, like true spirit and so forth, but in God, but it means there's the false sacred that humans create with power. The FDA decrees this is what you shall call medicine, or this is what you shall call food. And food and medicine are connected there because, for example, the FDA, the USDA, they subsidize toxic vegetable oils, which are industrial waste products. Humans shouldn't be consuming this at all. And I think it correlates to a lot of the rise of chronic diseases that we've had, but they decree it to be food and it's dirt cheap. And they've got a revolving door relationship with the big food companies that are staffing them. They're either former staff members of food companies or future staff members of food companies that run the FDA and so forth. And they say, hey, this is food. And then it gets people sick. And they say, well, that's the king's sacred medicine couldn't have gotten you sick. It must be the animals you're eating because we don't patent animals, so we don't own that. So demonize the red meat or whatever. So you see how this works here with your example with COVID. This is the king's regimen. Anything that says against it, off with your head. You're a monster. You're an enemy. And that's just not how reality works.
Well, the person who takes an interest in these possible alternatives is also, I guess, as you would term it, scapegoated. They're looked down upon as suspect at best. And I've seen a lot of this in my own life. I, basically grew up looking like a Mexican hippie kid. And I just looked like somebody who had weed in my car while I was driving. I just had that vibe. And I was quite proud of it. But believe me, it resulted in a lot of interrogations that never needed to happen. And then we fast forward 30 years and you can walk into a store and buy cannabis. So I've seen, how once a formerly banned substance will then get approval, meaning revenued. And so all of a sudden there's a little money in it. And this formerly horrible substance is no longer banned. As a matter of fact, cannabis as medicine is now a concept that most people tend to agree with as a possibility, if nothing else.
And obviously they had to respond because the crowd, the population was rising up and saying, we're not going to really take your laws seriously if you don't recognize some of the health benefits people are getting, right? So the politicians, they have to respond to the power of the crowd. But ultimately, that shows you that the god of our culture is the crowd still, right? Because it was the crowd that said, hey, we've changed our opinion at a majority level enough that you guys need to do something about letting us have access to this substance, right?
It's true. And that's how things eventually turn around. Similar situation with the FDA's approval of research into, for example, MDMA for traumatic therapy, particularly with returning vets. And this only came about because so many returning vets were finding help by breaking the law.
Right.
And certain organizations garnered together to start petitioning the FDA for at least a possibility of a research trial. So I guess in a sense, that's an indication that the people can eventually lead the king.
Yeah.
But there's also a double-edged sword aspect to this. For example, with cannabis. I mean, yes, it has medicinal properties. It's a plant. To me, it's as good or bad as any other plant. It is a very helpful plant. There's the whole fiber, protein, oil aspect to it, in addition to the medicinal use. But I would like to say that there's also a lot of just stoners in this world. So there's going to be people who take whatever it is, whether it's cannabis or MDMA or ivermectin, and they're going to use it in some way that may not be positive. But I guess that is the double-edged sword of freedom that we're supposed to have, in our own power, and not be reliant on what somebody else says is our only option for treatment, for self-treatment, basically.
Yeah, that brings me to a point I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, is this idea that, we have two approaches to dealing with these taboo medicines. And one is in the pursuit of hedonism and pleasure and numbing out. And then the other one is neither approval nor disapproval of the actual substance in play, but rather defense of the human person who may be using something in a bad way or a good way to say, look, I may not, because everybody's different. You have, like you said, some people abuse substances. But see, what happens in the culture is that when they legalize something, they don't usually go with the argument of defense of the human person. They go with the argument of let's make sacred the stoner culture, rather than, no, we're neither approving or disapproving. We're not saying every person who does something is a bad person or one way or the other. It's an individual case by case situation. But it's the idea is, why do we have to use violence and force to coerce people to change their heart? You know what I mean? If I'm friends with somebody and they're addicted to caffeine or sugar or cannabis, and I have a relationship with them, I should be able to use tough love to help them to get their senses back if I can, as they're in my relationship of love. But the state doesn't operate with that context. They don't have a relationship of love. They just put you in a cage with violence and say, you violated this taboo, therefore you get thrown into a cold cage. And that's not the way you solve problems like addiction or abuse of substances, no matter what they are, right?
In many cases, you're being imprisoned for your own safety. This was the case with cannabis through the 70s and 80s. I, have been in more than one little jail cell for my own safety, because I happen to have, a little piece of cannabis on my person. But I've experienced the same thing for peyote. Like, oh, we're protecting you. We're going to take this cactus away from you. You're going to do a little time in jail, and then you're not going to do that again. But the idea of freedom of choice is just blasted using that power. For example, like with the whole double-edged sword thing, something can be very good for you and still have danger to it. My favorite example is, I'm a very avid bike rider. Not only am I a bike rider, I have a fairly powerful electric bike that is a trail bike, and it's got a good little bit of horsepower to it. And so it's like a cross between a motorcycle and a bicycle.
Right.
Well, that thing has improved my health so much. I just can't even tell you. It's one of the healthiest things I do. I had a torn meniscus in my left knee for a while. And through riding this bicycle, you can't even tell that ever happened anymore. And obviously it's good for my mental health, riding out in the country trails. And, you know, in a lot of situations, I'm not going slow. And there is an element of danger to my daily bike ride that you just cannot deny.
Yeah.
And I would be foolish to deny it. But it takes attention, awareness, discipline, and a certain amount of faith to know that, hey, you know what? I'm going to go ride my bike for a half hour really fast because it's good for me. So I must be careful. I must pay attention. I must take care of myself. That personal responsibility goes along with our freedom of choice.
How did you feel when you were put in those cages for cannabis or peyote or whatever? What was that like? Can you tell us what your mindset feels like when you're going through that, maybe the first time?
Well, that term that we've all heard, man's inhumanity to man, became a real thing. And it totally changed my psychology about what is our responsibility in how we treat each other. Even in the sense of, like, let's say pet ownership. If you have a dog that you love, can you really chain that dog on a short leash and make it lay out in the sun, dependent on you to bring water and food or not? It really gave me an examination of, like, how are we supposed to treat each other?
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing like being paraded around. I mean, just quickly, I'll tell you that one of my episodes occurred in the country of Mexico, where I was participating in traditional ceremonies with native people down there. And at some point, just because of the way the drug war works down there and the, let's say, lack of principle of certain federal agents that is fairly common in Mexico, they will pick you up and drive you around their town, literally in the back of a truck with chains, with semi-automatic or automatic weaponry on you, just to make a show of you. Look what we did. We got the hippies. We're keeping your town safe. We're now taking them to jail, but we're going to cruise through town first to let you see them. So,
like they would do, they would parade that's a long practice. People parade their scapegoat around town to say, look what we've got, you know?
Right. This is still done in certain places.
Yeah.
And it's done here, but more subtly, you know, it's done on the evening news, you know, and by news clippings.
So some of my conservative type listeners or whatever, and even the liberals, because they're very heavy handed with wanting government to control what medicines we take or don't take recently. You know, they might say, well, you know, we just can't let people do whatever they want because they're going to destroy the culture. Like you said, you know, you may, you know, you, sir, may be very disciplined with your use of these medicines, but they're, you know, you're not representative of most people. Most people, you give them a toy and they're just going to go crazy with it, and they're going to destroy the culture, and families are going to be high and you know, abuse and all these different things that come with the association of drug abuse. So, you know, maybe some would say, hey, you know, you guys are naive. You want Christianity or that type of value, self-sacrifice, self-discipline, love of your neighbor, but we're not there yet. So we don't want to go through the whole freedom of choice deal until we fix our culture to be more ready for that kind of freedom, for those types of choices. What's your response?
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of messing up our culture by trying to not mess up our culture, from what I can tell.
Yeah.
It's a little ironic. And yet, what is the alternative? I have this possibly naive hope that I was raised with by my parents and my grandparents who were immigrants here, that we have the freedom to make a good life for ourselves. Mm-hmm. Let's try it. And some people give up, some people do a bad job, but it shouldn't stop the progress of those who just want to have a good life, raise a good family, and in many cases, like my own, use alternative methods of keeping ourselves whole and healthy. I consider myself kind of middle of the road because I'm socially very liberal. I think if somebody wants to shoot heroin, they should shoot heroin. But, you know, these days, I know that that's killing people left and right. And I cannot believe that it's my job to take away their freedom to have that option. At the same time, I don't want to shoot heroin, and I actually don't want to inject anything. And anybody who tries to force me to inject something, I'm going to be against it,
Yeah.
which again brings us up to the current political moment. So I find myself being frustrated. I'm thinking, you know, I thought we were beyond this. I thought my body, my choice, we had worked all these things out, you know, but apparently social coercion is still a powerful agent to get us to ingest experimental drugs. And this is everything that Nancy Reagan told me to not accept in my life. So,
Yeah. Well, you know, in the whole point about the opium problem, you know, first you've got the Afghanistan war that just ended so far, you know, and $2 trillion and opium production was going well there. So that kind of helped with the whole rise of fentanyl and so forth. And then you got this whole deal with, again, our government, you know, I interviewed Professor Bruce Hammock of UC Davis, and he published in Frontiers in Physics. Actually, that was the link you sent. That's right. You sent the link with the and that was a big, you know, you were to thank for getting that in my radar and corroborating that with Dr. Kate Shanahan. So thank you, you know, again, because that was a big piece of the puzzle. Dr. Kate Shanahan had predicted, she's a medical doctor, she was on Bill Maher and so forth over a year ago when the pandemic was still kicking off. And she was predicting that seed oils would be contributing to severe cases of this disease, this pandemic disease. And then lo and behold, you know, Professor Bruce Hammock and his team at UC Davis published that paper showing that severe cases of this disease are caused by the buildup of this linoleic acid, the leukotoxin that's connected to that consumption. So, you know, in our interview with Professor Bruce Davis, Bruce Hammock, he says that, you know, they're funded in part by the no drug issue with the government.
Right.
So you can see that the rise of this opium epidemic is contributed directly, and he thinks in a great amount of it, to our government. Again, assuming the role of we are the king, we will create mandates for you to go in here and we will force you to do this to keep your job. Well, they've been having that mindset in a more subtle way and sometimes direct for a long time, including we set the food guidelines, we set what hospitals feed their patients when they're sick, which is seed oil sludge sometimes. We set the terms. There is nobody but us. There is no God besides us. We are the kings of the world. Same thing we've been hearing for thousands of years. And they say, okay, you got to eat seed oils. And what happens? It creates this pain problem, chronic pain problem, which contributes to this opium problem, which they help facilitate because of Afghanistan, making that market a little bit more hotter than normal. I'm not saying they did it for that reason, but that seemed to be a side effect of them being over there. Taliban was locking that thing down a lot more, the opium. So you see how when they presume to be God, they make a holy hell mess of everything, you know?
And it kind of brings into relief the ridiculous idea that this same monolithic regime that is doing such a great job in Afghanistan is also going to do the right thing when it comes to our health.
Right. Yeah, they spent $1 billion, somebody showed me, on soybean oil production or something, trying to get the Afghanis to eat soybean oil, the sludge that we're bedazzled by. and it didn't work. They're like, no, we don't want this stuff, So, I mean, it's just insane. You think about it. Hey guys, I got a great idea. This Florida citrus industry is like a $9 billion a year industry. So you're taking one of that 9 billion for the whole production of citrus, orange juice, and you're taking that and you're throwing that Afghanistan and saying you need to eat the same toxic, carcinogenic, diabetes causing, cancer connected garbage that we're feeding our own citizens. And they said no. And it's like $2 trillion later, they're still saying no. And that no's a little more final now so far. So.
And good for them and their consistency. I mean, are you going to accept help from somebody who was formerly bombing you?
Right.
This is kind of the way that I feel with my own personal health. I'm like, wait, I know it's not monolithic. Like our government is comprised of individuals and there's not just one thing, but still in a simplistic way, I asked myself, are these people who were like, handcuffing me and throwing me in a can for having the wrong plant? These are the people I'm going to listen to now about
right.
what my next step should be to be okay.
Right.
It makes me very suspicious, and I don't like being that way. I'm more of a naturally trusting person. So when I found myself getting better from the COVID, it was funny, David, but one of the side effects I had not expected was that I was angry. I was like, wait a minute. Right. I have friends who died of this. And I felt helpless because I had already read that we had these therapeutics that are helpful. But what am I supposed to do? Call their doctor? Yeah. And it could make me cry just thinking about it. So feeling better just teed me off. Yeah. I was like, wait a minute, I'm better. Why can't we help people? And that's seriously, when I wrote you another note and I emailed you and I said, David, I think I've had it with this. I might be ready to discuss it because this is embarrassing. Like, how can we take such bad care of our people? Right. And the seed oil thing is an ever-present blanket, kind of smothering so many, and it's hard to get through. It's one of these things. Right. It seems like to me that it's going to take 30 years to reach public awareness. It reminds me of the whole movement to where margarine was better than butter. And eventually, people woke up from that slowly and still. But the seed oil thing is it's hard to crack. At least I think the Ivermectin COVID connection, when I mention it to people, at first they're a little bit shocked. They're like, wait, you took horse medicine? And I'm like, well, yes, because that was my option. As I was laying there with the fever, I can't afford that. I've got a kid, I've got work, and this was an option. So that does affect people. I think I can't quite get through a lot of people. I'm like, hey, you really ought to look at your consumption of seed oils. But boy, when you tell them about ivermectin, they're like, usually the question comes up, where would I get this if I needed to?
Well, and some doctors are prescribing it for this disease, and then the pharmacies refuse to fill the order. So it's really ridiculous. Right. And the FDA was so disingenuous. They put out that tweet saying, yeah, you guys knock it off with horse paste. And they were doing that. They're just so disingenuous. They're so politically bankrupt because it's like, well, yeah, there is a horse paste version of it, but there's also a human tablet version of it. And you specifically worded it in a way to make it look like it's only a horse medicine. And they don't talk about how it's been used with antiviral effects and research and real world case studies all over the world. 6 billion people, I think, have taken it or something. And it's on, it's a Nobel Prize winning drug with antiviral effects for other viruses, but they're so disingenuous and people don't understand. People are too faithful. They put their trust in men and kings rather than God. And they listen to these people and they say, well, they've got the credentials, they've got the lab coats, they've got the budget, they've got the TV, fawning coverage. They must be true. And they are so naive. They think, well, power means good. That's not correct. They're lording over people because, and it's a very simple thing. And I wish the left and the right could understand this because it's so simple. Their staff, our future or former employees of the pharmaceutical companies. It's not a conspiracy. It's just the way their business model, the pharmaceutical company's business model is we must come up, if there's a problem, we must always come up with new drugs that can stay on patent for a time. And that's how we make our money in the patent window. Once it's expired, it's basically dead to us. It's just, it's not very useful at all. Their whole business. So if you have an entity that says, I am a third party arbiter of what's safe and good and so forth, but their entire staff pretty much is all coming from either getting funding through their university purchase or, like in nonprofit purchase, or directly working for pharmaceutical companies whose entire business model is just with this narrow perspective of if there's a problem, create a drug and patent it. How are they possibly going to be able to understand? I'm being charitable to them. I'm saying, how could they possibly understand something that's completely contrary to their entire industry business model? Even if they mean well, of course they mean well. We always assume people mean well, right? And it's like your whole business model is problem equals find drug, patent it. And that precludes generic drugs. And it precludes dietary changes like getting seed oils out of your life. And it precludes sunshine, and it precludes the natural herbs that you're mentioning, right?
And perversely, if you question that narrative, you're the heretic. You're the suspicious one. You're the Galileo that has this crazy idea that should be, at the very least, put under house arrest. And that just seems like, if you can't question science, if you can be censored in your questioning, then I guess we don't really have science. As you say, we have a religion. It's more like Scientology than science, it seems like to me.
So let's briefly run through some of these different natural plants that you mentioned. And again, I don't know enough about a lot of these topics to say, oh, I'm for it or not. I want to let that be known. I'm new to a lot of this stuff. But right. Just in terms of, I have no, heavy opinion one way or another. But let's start with the one you mentioned first, peyote. What is the medicinal benefits that you have seen? Again, this is just your opinion for why you think this is something that people should not be caged for. Let's put it that way. I don't think people should be caged for seed oils, or those are toxic, but you can still eat the toxic stuff.
Right. Well, traditional people have a long association with the peyote cactus. There's archaeological evidence that this goes back at least 6,000 years in the Rio Grande Valley on our current border. And there's still traditional people that have a unbroken lineage associated with this particular plant, which in itself is interesting because a lot of these people don't live where it grows. So access to this plant that is far away from you has been a very important traditional anthropological artifact.
So would they go to journeys? They would take pilgrimages to get it or something?
Exactly. And many people still do. Many people. It's in my family lineage to accompany my elders down to South Texas or northern Mexico where it grows, and you make prayers there. You express your gratitude, and then you come back home with the medicine to take care of your family for the subsequent year. Well, just from a Western perspective, there are a lot of antibiotic properties to the plant itself. It's a virtual factory of alkaloids. It's kind of an unknown response as to why one plant would create over 60 alkaloids and dozens of other interesting molecular configurations for itself. Some people think, well, obviously it's to protect it from predators, give it a bitter taste, give the predator an effect that they don't appreciate, like nausea or bitterness or something like this. But if you look at it from another point of view, this plant is busy making medicine in the sunlight that is good for humans. And so, like I said, on a Western level, there's antibiotic properties. There's like streptococcus and staph infection properties, even just in a topical version of this plant. And the particular alkaloids that are responsible for these antibiotic properties have been fairly well studied. But then again, they're not patentable at this point, but they are looked into. So even today, among traditional people in Mexico, they'll make a salve out of the peyote cactus for rheumatism, for example, for skin lesions. So it's used externally. But the commonly known use is as what people have termed hallucinogenic. It is a Schedule 1 substance. It is in the same category as LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and actually, unfortunately, heroin, methamphetamine, which means it has no medicinal value by government rankings. But in larger amounts, it has the fairly well-known alkaloid mescaline in it, which Aldous Huxley, used to write about in his book Doors of Perception. It was popularized in the 60s and 70s among the hip crowd as being the premier traditional psychedelic substance. Well, that aspect of peyote does exist. It actually does exist. But honestly, in my own life, it's been the least interesting part of the peyote plant for me. I mean, if I want to have a vision, if I want to see Technicolor images, all I've got to do is turn on the internet. I'm really not that interested in seeing things that aren't there. I never have been. My experience with psychedelics has been that they generally have a lot more subtle effects that are actually very profound and important that have nothing to do with hallucinogenesis or what we would consider getting high or being stoned, because altered consciousness is such a taboo and unknown subject. I've always said, getting high is like politics, sex, and religion. You can't really talk about it and be doing it right. It's a subjective experience. So the subtle effects of peyote are that, and this is based on my experience, I would say one of the main effects is that one becomes more introspective, more self-examining, and that's an interesting effect. That is more something that we prescribe SSRIs for, like, hey, we're going to help you calm your brain down, or, Adderall for kids who can't concentrate. Like, we have this concept, oh, you take something and it changes your thoughts. Well, that's a very Western, simplistic concept, but in reality, the medicines in peyote actually do have this subtle effect of causing some reflection. It gives you a little more space between you and you. And you're like, wait a minute, have I been treating people right? Did I say the right thing when I was angry a little while ago and just went off on some, for some reason? And maybe this is like the entrance to the sacred here for me, because that is sacred. How you treat each other, how you respond to people in your life, how you treat your body, how you treat the things around you, the elements that you depend on, the water, the food that you're preparing. Like, there's a lot of subtlety to that. There's prayer involved. Any parent who has prepared meals for their children know that it's more like a prayer. While you're making food, you're saying, I want this to be good for my family. I hope they eat it. I hope it's not full of sugar. You have these thoughts about you want the best thing for your family. Well, peyote kind of turns that around on me and makes me feel that way about me. Like, hey, am I taking care of myself? Do I really love myself? Do I feel good? What have I been doing that makes me feel rotten? What could I do that would make me feel better, that would give me a more productive life? You have time to reflect.
And does it create paranoia or anxiousness for some people in that space, in that state?
I would say it's possible, but in my experience, peyote is the one so-called psychedelic that has the lesser amount of those possibilities. The one plant that has the greatest amount of those possibilities for me and for many people is cannabis. Just one toke over the line, and all of a sudden your whole world is in doubt. You're like, oh my God, even if they're not after me, I feel like they are. Like, you get this horrible, I call it like psychic road rash with cannabis, to where you do get paranoid. You lose touch with the safety that you were surrounded by 5 minutes previous, and that is not fun. I do not recommend it. In a sense, I'm very anti-recreational cannabis, because there's too many people that they'll have that experience, and what good did that do them? I don't think that helps anybody very much. But to answer your question, peyote is more of a slow, nothing happens right away. You know, we eat it in ceremony. We're sitting in a meditative state in a teepee around a fire, meditating on the fire. There's singing, there's drumming, there's prayers going on. So you have a lot of time. It's like a technology. The ritual itself is a technology that fits the medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Since this medicine requires time and induces a certain self-reflection and meditative state, well, the ceremony optimizes that. Everybody knows we're going to be in here all night. We're going to not leave. We're going to pay attention to the process that's going on with us. We're going to pray. We're going to support each other. We're going to keep this fire clean. We're going to keep all the elements in here in order so people can get around as they need to and feel comfortable. And so, like I say, the ceremony itself is geared to the effects of the medicine, and that's beautiful. It's a very therapeutic space. So given that, there's very little room for like freaking out, because you're among elders, you're among people who've been here hundreds of times. It's the best support network that I've ever seen in my life. It is literally therapy. And it's used as such by traditional people. There's you can Google this, but you will find very positive effects are indicated, for example, in alcoholism and drug abuse, which is a little counterintuitive. Some people might say, how can I get help from alcoholism or my heroin addiction by eating another drug? That doesn't make sense to me. But in fact, a lot of people get help with their addictive tendencies and their addictions by that 12-hour-long meditation of sitting, ingesting this medicine, and reflecting on their life. What do I want out of my life? And guess what? The sun comes up in the morning and it's a new day. And you have a support group. And you have good food that you share. And you talk and you hang out and you get to know each other's children. There is just nothing healthier in my life that I know how to do personally.
Yeah, I was thinking about, you were talking about anxiety. I think caffeine causes anxiety for a lot of people. You know?
Yeah, good one. And if you don't have that in the morning, there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, so many of what we ingest, because food and medicine kind of have a continuum. And what we ingest is so based on mimetic groupthink and mimetic conformity about what the tribe says, so if you don't drink caffeine, if you don't look at that. If you don't take that drug, you're not cool at the office sometimes. Wait, you don't drink caffeine? We're sipping on 3 cups. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? Fit in, do the drug we do. This is what it means to be a successful worker bee in our society. It's funny, peer pressure to fit in. Or if you go to the bar and order water, well, why aren't you drinking like we're all drinking, Or, if you have a disease that's very popular in the media right now, why aren't you doing the drugs that we do instead of doing something else or whatever, So there's a lot of pressure to take drugs that you don't maybe not want to, It's not just about the pressure on the underground side of things, the whole illegal part of it. There's a lot of pressure to take illegal drugs all the time, right? In different social settings.
It's a big cult. It's a big cult out there.
Yeah.
And they have their sacraments.
And when you look at some others like milk thistle, you mentioned milk thistle in an email to me. What's something we can learn about milk thistle?
Well, interestingly enough, I have a little story of I used to live on a ranch, and I was next to a regular cowboy ranch, real hardworking, honest cowboys that ran my neighbor Mr. Cowboy friend came over for something or another, and he saw this plant growing outside my doorstep, and he looks at it and he says, "What? Why haven't you killed that? That's a bad plant." And what it was a milk thistle plant. And I told him, "Friend, about 5 years ago, I came down with hepatitis A while living in Mexico. And when I got back home, I was so ill, I thought I was going to die. And I just could not get out of bed. Could not. I could barely get up out of bed just to take care of myself. And couldn't eat, was yellow, fever, just in pain. Everything hurt. And a friend of mine heard that I had contracted hepatitis, and he overnighted me a glycerin extract, no alcohol, but a liquid glycerin extract of milk thistle seed. He said, "Take this. Take so many drops 3 times a day and let me know what's going on." So I received it the next day, and I had now been in bed for probably at least a week, 9-10 days. Well, by the afternoon of taking that first little bit of extract of milk thistle seed, I felt noticeably better. And just like the ivermectin, I couldn't decide, wow, was that just a coincidence? Was I gonna get better? But sure enough, it turns out that milk thistle is a very healing agent for liver situations. And when you have hepatitis, your liver just basically has shut down. And I never knew where my liver was until I had hepatitis, because that thing hurt. It was just in pain, and I could feel exactly where my liver was. So that milk thistle relieved my pain within 24 hours. 48 hours later, I'm doing pretty good. By the third day, I was up and around. Well, that put me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I wanted to learn everything I could about this. And it turns out that it's been known about for a long time. And thank God you can buy it in most health food stores. Even drugstores will have a little extract called Silmarin, extract of milk thistle seed. And it's a very protective medicine for the liver. As it turns out, in Europe, it's kind of standardized in a lot of places where they deal with a lot of poisonous mushroom episodes every summer. Because every year somebody's going to eat the wrong mushroom. Usually it's one of those they call the death cap, the death mushrooms people will mistake for edible mushrooms, but it happens every year. And in many European countries, it's this milk thistle extract is kept in stock because, I haven't looked it up lately, but you can find studies that indicated that where in normal mushroom toxin situations, where you might expect a death rate of 50%, that using milk, there was 0%. So 100% survivability. It appears to make that much of a difference when your liver has shut down. So I became to love that plant. And when my neighbor came over and said, "You need to get rid of that," I spent a lot of money on herbicides getting that out of my field. That's a bad plant. I said, "Friend, I don't believe in bad plants." And I didn't bother to tell him the story of how it had saved me, but I knew. And I didn't feel the need to try to convert anybody here, but I just tried to be polite and said, "Okay, I hear you."
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, you don't get the FDA or anybody talking about milk thistle that I'm aware of. So
Right.
What about tobacco? That's another one. they used to say, smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. Doctors recommend it. It's good for you. But you mentioned tobacco in a positive light. Now, some people have said, inhaling that, tobacco smoke is bad for you, regardless of how it's packaged. Other people say, no, the carcinogenic and other lung debilitating aspects of cigarettes is in the actual, chemicals that they add and so forth. I don't have an opinion either way. What's your opinion on this?
Well, that's a funny one, because if you were raised in the 50s and 60s, watching the movies, watching the TV, Marcus Welby, MD, if you were cool, you smoked, and that was just fashionable. And everybody knows that we were led down that path, and it was stupid. So
it was what?
You get to our day, and it's obviously uncool to smoke.
Right.
I mean, and this has happened fairly quickly in culture. tobacco happens to be one of the primary plants that virtually every traditional tribe in the Americas had an association with. It didn't matter if you were Hopi or Cheyenne, you could be far south in the Amazon, and somebody would use tobacco in that tribe. And it was used in many different ways. Smoking has only been one of the ways. In traditional herbal medicine, it's a very important plant for topical use, for bruising, for fractures, as like a healing poultice from the external. It's well known as an insecticide. For natural organic gardeners, you can use tobacco to make a pretty effective insecticide. It's also been commercialized in that sense to much negative effect, by the way. But the truth of it lies somewhere in between, because in traditional Native American ceremonies, it's the primary plant to pick up the hotline to God. In other words, when you have a serious need and you need to make a serious request of spirit, whatever you consider that to be, tobacco is considered for some reason by tribe after tribe after tribe, regardless of geography, as the one that you use to do that. So fixing tobacco itself is a prayer. You either collect it in the wild or you grow it, you take care of it, you keep it around your place, you roll it often into a corn husk, or as we know, there's also the pipe method among traditional people for using tobacco. And this is where we get the term peace pipe, but it was a plant that we shared in prayer. And even symbolically, if you think about it, let's say a teepee full of people are using tobacco to pray. Well, they're each individually using this plant, but their smoke unites in the air and rises up into the sky as a common prayer. So just even on the symbolic side of it, it's used for prayer. Mm-hmm. And having said all that, I believe in that strongly. I practice it in my own life. I've been shown how to do this. I didn't just come upon it or read it in a book. Traditional people showed me how to use tobacco. And in particular, I was having what I guess I would call a severe mental and emotional and physical breakdown back in the year 2006. I had gone through a lot of things that my life was just feeling like it was at its end. I couldn't eat. I had gotten down to something like 122 pounds, and people were concerned about me. People thought I was on drugs. And I had an old friend show up to visit me, hadn't seen me in years, and they said to me, "You've got to do something. You've got to get help. I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm not going to let you just kill yourself by not eating and by not taking care of yourself and by being kind of crazy." And I couldn't think of one person that I could go to for help. I'm not the kind of person who's going to go try to book a psychologist that I don't know, a psychiatrist. I didn't know what to do. I was just lost. But this friend said, "I'm going to give you the phone and you're going to call somebody. I don't care who it is, but you're going to just start to try to help yourself." Well, I thought of one man, and he's a traditional Navajo medicine man. And for some reason, I thought, well, I think that's the only man I can trust right now with what I'm going through. At least I can talk to him. So I called him on the phone and he said, "Oh, yeah, here's what you want to do. You go out, you find this wild tobacco. You know what it is, right?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Well, you got to go out. You got to find yourself some of it. You take it." And he gave me basically a prescription on how to use it to help myself. And it sounded very simplistic. I said, "Okay, I'm pretty sure I can find a plant. I kind of know where they grow up here in these hills. And I know I can do what you're telling me because it's very simple. And I'm going to trust you with this. I'm just going to do it, even just to be able to tell my friend, well, look, I did something. I tried to get some help." So I followed through. And you know what? It was not fun. It was cathartic, to say the least. It was not in any way pleasant. But when I finished using that tobacco the way he instructed me, Sure enough, I was better. It was actually a miracle. I told friends that it was the most powerful psychedelic experience I ever had in my life because it totally changed my headspace. And it wasn't psychoactive as such. It was just that I went through this little performance ritual with faith. And my faith rewarded me with clarity. And, lo and behold, within the next week, I gained like 10 pounds, just out of nowhere. I had an appetite. Now, I can't say that some substance in the tobacco had that effect. All I know is that I got help through its use. So that's how I feel about tobacco. And if somebody hands me like a Marlboro cigarette to smoke, or I'm around it or something, I get nauseous. If I try to smoke a commercial cigarette, I have to take a shower because I can't stand the smell on my fingers just from holding the thing. And just so you know, I'm very suspicious of tobacco cigarette filters. Depending on how deep you want to dig, there's a lot of evidence that those little microcilias, the substance that's used as a tobacco filter, is probably just as bad for you to be inhaling microparticles of as any tobacco smoke. On top of that, commercial tobacco is just completely stepped on chemically, as you mentioned. And if I take a puff of a regular cigarette, my lungs shut down. I used to have bronchitis when I was a kid, and I will get an instant flashback. But also, just to distinguish, if I use a natural tobacco, it's perfectly okay. It doesn't have this horrible stink like a bar. It's a completely different animal than what people are out there smoking when they go to their little convenience store and buy a Mountain Dew and a pack of Marlboro Lights. It's just not the same thing at all, to be clear.
Well, that was a great segue to how I wanted to kind of end this, is just that, these are all interesting topics. And at the end of the day, like you mentioned, sometimes it's more about the ritual that you do rather than whether there's actually something special in the actual substance. And I'm not, that doesn't mean you endorse whatever you want to take. No, we're not saying that, but just take whatever you want. But we certainly shouldn't use violence, regardless, to impose onto our neighbor for what, whether they should be forced to take a medicine or not take a medicine of any type. And it reminds me of this book, How Healing Works, by Dr. Wayne Jonas, which talks about how to stay well using your hidden power to heal. And in the book, it talks about how the community agreeing that you're taking, they were talking about placebo effects and how they healed people. And they were astonished by it because they said there's really no statistical much of a difference between these pharmaceutical drugs and the placebos, and these companies don't really want to talk about that. But it's more about the ritual of going to a man with a white coat and he says, take this pill. And everybody around you says, oh, I think you're getting better. And they all kind of come together with you. And that whole communal aspect of agreeing that you're taking medicine, that it's fixing you, and you agreeing and believing in it, is where a lot of the healing happens. And I think there's a physics level component to that Dr. Yu talks about with magnetism, that that's just another topic for another time. But there's also that spiritual level of our minds and how we were meant to be interdependent, individual, and and how much power we have in that, regardless of what modality of health treatments we seek out. Sometimes it's the journey that matters more than the destination of where you're headed.
Right. I have a feeling, since you bring it up, that placebo medicine may be the most forbidden medicine of all and may end up being the most important. We just can't tell right now because we're really primitive. The research on the seed oils that you got me interested in originally, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, we're barely figuring out how the human body works. And yet we're acting like we know it all. And we can decide what's best for you. But we barely have a clue. So in the future, I do have a considerable amount of faith that placebo medicine will be more important than we ever thought it might be.
Yeah, very good. That's a great way to leave it off. I really appreciate your time, sir. It's been a pleasure getting to talk to you, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
Thank you, David. Pleasure talking to you.
Very good. Take care.